Good morning. Here we are coming up to the very end of another year. And as Tim made mention at the beginning of our time together, it affords us kind of a unique perspective, if you will, to do a couple of things. Number one, as he made mention, to look back into the year 2024. To think about the way in which we conducted ourselves, the things that we involved ourselves with, to make sure that this past year was the kind of year that we needed to have, spiritually speaking, for sure. But also when we come to the end of a year, it also affords us an opportunity, not just to look backwards, but to also look forwards in what lays ahead. Oftentimes, we get to this part of the year, and we begin making plans even for the year that will come. Now, it's good to make plans, and it's important to make plans, but biblically speaking, God wants us to understand that as His people, as we make plans for the future, as we make plans for a year ahead or days ahead, that we do so with the right mindset. We do so with the right focus, with the right view, if you will. Maybe you've heard the phrase in the past used, "We'll do such and such," or "such and such will happen, Lord willing." And maybe you've heard that phrase used. Maybe you've used a phrase such as that in the past. I want us for a few minutes this morning to take that idea, to take that phrase that we often utter, that we often use, that we often hear, and I want us to meditate for a few minutes upon a phrase such as that. And I want us to make sure that we understand that it is a phrase, if used, there is some connotation behind it. There needs to be some focus behind it. There needs to be some view, correct view, put behind it. And what's going to help us is this passage that was just read in James chapter 4. In James chapter 4, specifically in verse 13, it seems that James is getting on to some people here about something. Now, we've got to go a little bit deeper into the context to kind of figure out what it is that James is getting on to them about, and we've got to ask ourselves, well, what is it that they've done? What is it that they have seen to have done wrong? What is it that they seem to need to refocus on or to fix in some capacity? You read James chapter 4 and verse 13, and you run across people that seemingly are planning to set out on a trip, and they're going to do so either today or they're going to do so tomorrow. They have a plan to arrive at a certain destination. They have a plan to spend a certain amount of time there. They have a plan to engage in some sort of business there. And they also have a plan to have some certain results. We read those things and we have the question, what then seems to be the problem? Is it a problem to plan to go to certain places? Is it a problem to do certain things, such as suggested here in verse 13? Or is the issue something else? And I think fleshing out the context, especially in the next couple of verses, helps make it clear what the issue is. And the issue becomes, if we are to make plans, we have to do so with the right view. And what James chapter 4, especially these three verses, 13, 14, and 15, it is in a lot of ways the preacher's dream passage. Because what it does in a very simple kind of way is it kind of establishes an issue or a problem, as you have in verse 13. And then what God does is He gives us a 2-point sermon, 1 point in verse 14 and 1 point in verse 15 that helps us to deal with this issue. And so when we think about and the plans that we are to make in thinking about the future, that we are to have the right view, one of those views in verse 14, one of those views in verse 15, and as is commonly said, the lesson will be yours. So let's get into what those views are. The first view is this. If we're going to make plans, it's not a bad thing to do. It's an important thing to do, to think about the days ahead. We must do so with the right view of life itself. We have to do so with the right view of life itself. Look at what James says in verse 14. He says, you've made plans, verse 13, to do all of these things, but do you have the right view of life itself? And so he says, whereas you do not know what will even happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. He says, yes, you're going to make plans in the future, and that's okay, but you've got to do so with the right view of life. And the right view of life is temporary. Life is fleeting. And we're reminded of this throughout Scripture. That there is no durability on this earth, that our time specifically is short. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 1, the proverb writer says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Jesus will tell us a story in Luke chapter 12. You can turn over there. We'll read it together. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus shares with the people there and with us a parable about this same kind of mindset that we need to operate with. And he says in Luke chapter 12 and verse 16 beginning, he says, he spoke a parable to them saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, well, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? And so he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to them, fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and then whose will those things be which you have provided? And so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You see, Jesus tells a story, and it is a story in which he is reminding them and us we need to plan, but with the right view of what life is. And life is temporary. Life is fleeting. Life can come to an end at any moment. And it's not as if it's wrong to plan, but we've got to do so then with the right mindset. I think it's interesting culturally how we count life. Think about that. For instance, I was born on March 2nd, 1976. That's when I was born. And every single March 2nd since 1976, beginning with 1977, and then again in 1978, and then again in 1979, and so forth, 48 times total, we have celebrated my birthday. And we count our life that way. I'm sure you'd have to ask my parents. I don't remember it. But I'm sure at my first birthday on March the 2nd, 1977, there was a cake involved, there were presents involved, there were cards involved, and there were probably ones all over the place, whether on the cake or on the cards or on balloons. And then when March 2nd, 1978 came along again, there probably were cards and presents and cakes and balloons involved, all of them with the number 2 on it, and so forth. That's how culturally we count our life. We count our life in years. And it's okay to do so. But we can't lose sight of biblically how God asks his people to count life. Do you think much about that? Biblically, God, when talking to his people, doesn't say count your life in years. He says count your life in days. Psalm 90 and verse 12. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. How does he do that? Well, what's the difference in that? You see, the mindset of counting our life in years lulls us into thinking that, you know what, March 2nd, 2025 is going to roll around. I'm looking forward to that day. It is my birthday, and I'll be 49 years old. You see the difference in, as God says, teach us to number our days. Operating with the understanding that possibly tomorrow doesn't roll around. Teaching us that maybe Tuesday of this week doesn't roll around. So why then is that important? I think in a lot of ways it gets us into the position to understand that we need not waste our lives, but invest our lives. We've just finished, even though we do have one more class to go, but we have finished in our adult Bible class over this past trimester a study through the Gospel of Mark. And so that, in a lot of ways, is where my head has been over the last several months. And there's a passage in Mark chapter 14, that I think helps us to see and understand what God is trying to get us to see and understand ourselves. In Mark chapter 14, it is towards the very end of Jesus' life, and it is a long chapter. We kind of joked around in our Bible class that, we seem to have spent 3 weeks in Mark chapter 14. And it is a long chapter, and there's a lot of things happening. But just by way of context, it is Jesus coming up to the very last hours even of his life. And he's spending time with his disciples in the upper room, and they celebrate the Passover there, and Jesus has a huge amount of teaching for them. They leave that place, and they go to the garden where Jesus prays. Ultimately, afterwards, is betrayed by Judas and arrested. But listen to Jesus in the garden. In Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 32, think about the admonition he has. The text tells us that they came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. And he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." And he went a little farther. And he fell on the ground, and he prayed that if were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." And then he came, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." I was thinking about that passage this week. We studied it in Bible class several classes ago, but I was thinking on that passage this week. Knowing that we have already studied a text such as Psalm 90 and verse 12, where we're told to number our days. And I was already thinking that that's different already than how we normally number our years. And God says, you number your days. And I was thinking about this passage, and here Jesus, With his three apostles that were there with him, Peter, James, and John, he says, number this hour. Number this hour. He goes and prays, comes back and finds them sleeping. And what does he say? Could you not have watched? Could you not have stayed focused this 1 hour? What's the admonition that he gives? Watch and pray. Why? Why is that so important to do that? Well, Jesus tells us. The flesh is weak. And because of the weakness of the flesh, our focus, our view has to be so pinpointed and what life is and how fleeting life is, that each and every day, each and every hour, we are focused on our purpose. We are focused on our God. Because it may be the last day that we're here. It may be the last hour that we're here. So when it comes to making plans, number one, here in verse 14, we have to have the right view of life. We cannot stop for a spiritual rest, as Peter, James, and John are doing here, at any moment. Because no one wants, in a moment of rest, Jesus to come back and to ask the question, why are you sleeping? But back to James chapter 4. It's not just that we are to have the right view of life. James will go on to say that if we are to make plans, we must also have the right view of God, His place and His role in our plans. And so he says in verse 15, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. And there is that phrase that we talked about at the beginning, Lord willing. And it's a phrase that you probably have heard and possibly even have used. And it is a phrase that pops up biblically quite often. For instance, in Acts chapter 18 and verse 21, you have a verse and a sentence such as this. I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, Paul says, God willing. There's that phrase that we've seen. Paul will use it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 19. But I will come to you shortly if the Lord wills. And so you see this phrase again. But it is more than just the reality that God is in control. That certainly is there, for sure. That certainly is in play. Living in that reality that God is in control, but more so than that, we need to have all that we do in God's hands. That's James chapter 4 and verse 15. Did you notice the very end of that? If the Lord wills, we shall live. We shall do this. We shall do that. I think we can flip that coin over. If the Lord does not will, we should not do this or should not do that. And so when we think about it in the way that it's used here, it's so much more than just a statement that's thrown out. It's an attitude of the heart. Look at Jesus again in John chapter 4. Maybe you've noticed already as we read in Mark chapter 14, even though we were making another point about Jesus' admonition to Peter, James, and John. We've talked about this phrase already, so you probably had it in your mind as Jesus prayed to God and he asked for this cup to pass by. You probably noticed he makes the point Jesus does. It's not my will, but it is your will that things happen. And so that point has already happened and been made. But listen to Jesus. In John chapter 4, there is an interesting conversations about Jesus and his movement, and he's not eating a lot because he doesn't have time to do so. And so, there's all kinds of interesting things going on. We'll pick up that context in verse 31. In the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." And he said to them, "I have food to eat of which you do not know." And here's classic Jesus. He's going to take this physical conversation and move it spiritual very quickly. He says there in verse 33, "Therefore the disciples said to one another, Has anyone brought him? Has anyone brought him anything to eat?" And Jesus said in verse 34, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to finish his work." My food, my sustenance, what fuels me in this life is the purpose that I have within the will of God. What an incredible attitude that would be. What fuels us? What moves us? Is it this world? Is it things of this world? Is it material things of this world? What fuels us? Is it God's will? His purpose for us? That's certainly what fueled Jesus. And so when we begin to think about that, we need to continue to think about, well, what does that mean, or what does that look like? I want us to think about the reality that everything in the universe operates according to laws in some capacity. For instance, we all understand and we operate within the laws of gravity, right? All of us do. All of us operate within the laws of gravity. Let me explain and to demonstrate that for you. I have this little foam dice. And because I understand and operate within the laws of gravity, I'm able to walk over here to the edge of this stage, and I can throw this dice, and Monsanto could catch it. I'm able to do that because I'm operating within the laws of gravity. I'm up here, he's down there. I can throw it to him. Gravity is going to kind of take it down to where he's seated. We understand that. That's how it operates. Well, I can make choices outside of the realm of gravity and the laws of gravity, but if I do so to great consequence. For instance, I could climb to the top of this building, and I could jump off of it. But now I'm operating outside of the laws of gravity. I could choose to do that, but I'm going to face dire consequence, right? In a very similar kind of way. That's what the will of God is. I can work inside his will. I can work inside of the will of God. Or I could choose to operate outside of his will. But if I choose to operate outside of the will of God, I do so to great consequence. And so for us, we've got to know what that will is. We've got to know what that will is. Acts chapter 22 and verse 14. The God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know his will. Colossians chapter 1. Let's look over to that passage together. Colossians chapter 1. Again, the Apostle Paul, in writing about these kinds of things, these are phrases that we find throughout the pages of the New Testament. In Colossians chapter 1 and verse 9, listen to what he says. For this reason, we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding. A couple of pages back in Ephesians chapter 6, not far back from where you were in Colossians chapter 1, but in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, he says, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from his heart. And so we think about all of those passages. Number one, in order to operate in the will of God, we've got to know his will. We've got to know it. Well, we've got to read, we've got to study, we've got to see what God's will for my life is. And in order to operate within the will of God, I've got to know what his will is. But secondly, as we just read, I also need to be filled with his will. But not just that, I've got to do his will. And that full circles us back to James chapter 4. If the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. So let's close with a couple of applications. It is inevitable, as we come to the end of a year, for us to be thinking about what is to come. It's human nature in a lot of ways. We come to the end of something, even though we know the calendar is going to turn, we are thinking about 2025. We certainly have done that. We have added things to our calendar in January, February, March, April, May, and June already. And I don't love to operate that way. My parents will tell you I prefer to operate as the Lord directs, one day at a time. That's the way I'd prefer to do. I'm going to start using that. They'll often call and they'll say, listen, you got any plans for a June 11th of this next year? I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing next Tuesday, much less June 11th. But like me, you probably have been thinking about things that you've got going on in the next year. Plans for your children, plans for your jobs, plans for your vacation, plans to do things and to go places. And it's right to make those plans. But as we operate in this life, thinking ahead, we must do so with the right view. Number one, the right view of life. That even though I may be making plans for May of 2025, it is with an understanding that tomorrow of 2024 may never come for me. And for the follower of Christ to live with the view that that would be fantastic. That I don't put above the plans that I'm making in 2025 above an opportunity to be with Christ for eternity. That I'm not living in the mindset that if I were asked if Christ could return today, if I'm living with the mindset that I say, that would be okay, I guess. But if he could just hold off a little bit longer, that would be better. Because I've got so many great things planned. That's not the right view of life. But we've got to do so with the right view of God. That he is in control. And I will operate, even in the plans that I make, only those things that are inside his will and move me forward for his purpose. If I'm operating outside of the will of God, I do so at my own peril and consequence, in foolishness. I need to come back to where His will is. And maybe that takes picking up this book and become more acquainted with what His will is, making those decisions as we move forward. You know, it's not wrong to think about the year that we have coming up, but we've got to do so with the right view. And so as we close our time here, and Tim is going to lead us in a song of invitation and encouragement, it really gives us that opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to be thinking about where we are with God, where we are in our relationship with Him. It is the relationship that matters. And maybe you're here this morning and you know your relationship with God is not where it needs to be. Maybe you're here this morning and you've not even began a relationship with God because of your sin. And you know that sin can be washed away through the waters of baptism. Maybe we can help you with that. Maybe there's some other spiritual need that you have that we can help you with this morning. If that's the case, you let us know as we stand and as we sing.